Hi, everyone. On behalf of Melissa Randazzo, Max Freeman, and Mikladi Kadyamusama, welcome to the very first installment of the New York Communication Disorders Colloquium series. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We're fortunate to have two great speakers today, Dr. Christine Brennan from University of Colorado Boulder, and Dr. Lakeisha Johnson from Florida State University. They'll both talk about reading, but from two very different angles. Dr. Brennan will go first, followed by Dr. Johnson. Before I introduce Dr. Brennan more fully, here's a little bit of internet etiquette. So please, if you don't mind, keep your microphone muted unless you're called on to ask a question during the Q&A period. Try to avoid any distracting movements. Please utilize the chat if you have questions during the session. Max Freeman will be moderating the chat and we'll ask the questions at the end. And then for the live Q&A, please use the raise hand feature or the thumbs up feature to ask a question. And then I'll have you unmute and you can go ahead and ask your question. Okay, so now to our first talk, Dr. Christine Brennan. Dr. Christine Brennan is an assistant professor at the University of Colorado Boulder in the Department of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences. She's a speech-language pathologist and developmental cognitive neuroscientist. She earned her BA from Southern Connecticut State University and her MA and PhD from Northwestern University. She directs the Applied Neuroscience for Communication and Reading Lab at UC Boulder, and she's a member of the Institute of Cognitive Science and the Intermountain Neuroimaging Consortium at UC Boulder. She's published her work in many high-impact journals, including Human Brain Mapping, Neuroimage, and Developmental Science. So without further delay, Dr. Brennan will go ahead and present.
Thank you. And there you go, and I can share my screen. Give me a moment. Okay, did that work? You can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So my talk is titled Cortical Network Activation Associated with Typical and Impaired Reading. There we go. According to the NIH, dyslexia is a specific learning disability and it is neurobiological in origin. Dyslexia is characterized by a specific impairment in reading development and reading ability. Deficits can include phonological decoding, which is sounding out words using phoneme-grapheme correspondence, sight word recognition, and spelling. In the US, approximately 5 to 15% of people have dyslexia. Behavioral studies have described and investigated several subtypes of dyslexia. This includes phonological dyslexia, which is characterized by difficulty reading pseudo-words, which requires phonological decoding. At the same time, recognition of irregular words or words that cannot be decoded is relatively intact. Another type of dyslexia is surface dyslexia, which is characterized by difficulty reading irregular words, while phonological decoding remains, again, relatively intact. Now, most imaging studies, MRI and fMRI and EEG and so on, tend to group all of these subtypes together. So little is known about the cortical patterns that are associated for each type. Such comparisons could lead to evidence of neurological differences between subtypes, which in turn could lead to improved understanding, improved treatment plans, and improved learning outcomes. Now, the cortical network that supports reading is essentially the language network. One subtle difference is that the modality is visual, and reading requires visual processing, and thus mapping between visual and auditory information. Engagement of the left fusiform gyrus is necessary for visual recognition of words and letters, and actually numbers too. And this region is also known, which actually this term you might know is referred to as the visual word form area, or VWFA. In this slide, or this figure, it's labeled as FG for fusiform gyrus. Now, phonological processing involves the left STG, or superior temporal gyrus, just like when you're processing spoken speech, and the left IPL, or inferior parietal lobule, engages basically as a bridge between the visual and the auditory modalities. And as a result, it supports the mapping between visual letters and phonological information. For segmental phonology, which is needed for decoding, the left IFG, or inferior frontal gyrus, specifically Brodmann area 44, plays a critical role. And I also have the left IFG, Brodmann area 45 highlighted here because this region is involved in top-down processes, specifically related to the mapping between phonology and orthography. And finally, as with spoken language, the left MTG, or middle temporal gyrus, is associated with processing meaning. Now, it's been known for quite a while that there is a disruption of this cortical network that typically would support reading skills in individuals with dyslexia. Specifically, the left IPL, left fusiform gyrus, and left IFG are disrupted. In other words, what you typically tend to see is weaker activation during reading tasks in individuals with reading disability, even when they're active or even when they're accurately reading for the task. So it's not just simply that they're not reading. Even when they're reading, you see underactivation or weak engagement of these regions. Now, much attention has been given to these posterior regions, specifically the inferior parietal lobule and the fusiform gyrus. And one of the reasons that this has been of interest is because we see that reading skill is positively correlated with how strongly these regions activate. Interestingly, the IFG, inferior frontal gyrus, has been found to increase as kids get older and as reading skills advance. Now, I also want to use this model of reading as, I guess, a framework for my talk as well. This is the dual route cascaded model of reading. This suggests that there are, well, let's focus on two routes to reading. One is the lexical route. In this route, which on this slide is indicated by the blue arrow, is a route in which visual forms of words are mapped directly to meaning from within the mental lexicon. If this route were to be disrupted, there would be difficulty mapping words to meaning. This aligns with that subtype that we mentioned, surface dyslexia. Now, the other route on this slide is indicated by the green arrow, is the non-lexical route. If this engages grapheme phoneme mapping or conversion. In other words, this is the route for phonological decoding or sounding out words letter to sound. If this route were disrupted, there would be difficulty reading pseudo words or fake words or even unfamiliar words, since those words would not be recognized by the semantic system. And here what I've done is I've combined the dual route model with the cortical regions as we understand their role in reading. And so what you can see is that in the non-lexical route, you have engagement of left IPL, left IFG, and left STG. And for the lexical route, you see engagement of left fusiform gyrus and middle temporal gyrus for access to meaning. So what novel information or what additional information could further fMRI imaging add to our understanding of dyslexia or its subtypes? Well, for one, a better understanding of individual differences, the ability to identify regions recruited and determine if there are differences for different types of dyslexia as compared to controls. This includes the identification of regions that might be intact or are functioning typically versus those that are disrupted. For those with dyslexia, fMRI research could also help determine if regions within the network are associated with reading strengths or relative reading strengths or weaknesses, or with the use of compensatory strategies. In general, all of this can extend our understanding of the neurological basis of dyslexia. So now I'm going to present to you two fMRI studies that I have done that investigate cortical engagement associated with reading skill and with reading impairments. The first study compares cortical network activation associated with different subtypes of or profiles of dyslexia. And the second examines organization in the auditory cortex, specifically in the left STG and MTG, in adults with typical but varied reading skill. So for this study, I investigated cortical activation in several key regions within the reading network. Subjects included a group of children with typical reading skills, these were the controls, and then two children with dyslexia, each of whom had a different reading profile that aligned with a different dyslexia subtype. The aims were to determine if network activation differed between these two individuals with different subtypes of dyslexia, and also to look at those different patterns of activation as it relates or related to their reading performance. I hypothesized that differences in activation patterns would align with individual reading profiles, in other words, with the individual's strengths and weaknesses. So specifically, if sight word reading was a relative strength, I expected that the regions that are associated with the lexical route would be more engaged, and there should be greater engagement of orthographic regions such as fusiform gyrus and the semantic regions. If decoding was a relative strength, the non-lexical route should be more engaged, and there should be greater engagement of phonologic regions, such as the left IPL, left STG, and left IFG. So was I behind the slide there? I think I was, sorry. There we go. So for methods, I compared activation of two children with dyslexia to a group of children with typical reading skill. In the scanner, the children performed a visual rhyming task that required recognition of two words or pseudo words that were presented in sequence and their phonology. So to do this, kids were asked to indicate with a button press whether or not the two words that they saw in sequence either rhymed or did not rhyme. And both words and pseudo words were presented. For the data analysis, I conducted several region of interest analyses, which compared activation strength of the group to each individual child with dyslexia. And these regions, or ROIs, were selected based on a group analysis of all the kids, including the two with dyslexia. So I found the regions that were active for all these kids. Now, as mentioned, I compared two children with distinct reading profiles to a group of controls. Here are the profiles of those two children. Both of these children have a confirmed diagnosis of dyslexia that was made by either an educational neuropsychologist or an educational psychologist. Interestingly, during our testing, they both scored in the low, but in the average range. So for research purposes, we would actually refer to these children as having compensated dyslexia, even though it's well documented that they have had developmental dyslexia for a long period of time. This may be because both of these kids received intervention over the last several years prior to being in the study. What I'd like to draw your attention to are the scores that I have highlighted in color. The child who is labeled as the decoder has a profile that matches surface dyslexia with better decoding skills and weaker sight word recognition. And in contrast, the other child is labeled as a sight word reader and has a profile that matches phonological dyslexia. And this child has better sight word recognition and weaker decoding, specifically when you look at that timed test, which is the Tower decoding subtest, which was a standard score of 85. So this is these are the graphs that show the results of the rhyming task that was done in the scanner. So these are the behavioral results. The graph on the left shows accuracy, and the graph on the right shows reaction time. You can see that the decoder has slightly lower accuracy than the sight word reader and the controls. And for reaction time, you can see that the controls are much faster than the two children with dyslexia. And this aligns very well with what we know about dyslexia, that even when accuracy improves, usually due to intensive and effective intervention, speed of decoding and word recognition is still slow. So for the results of the imaging data, I'm actually going to show you a series of box plots. So let me just walk you through this. For each graph, the box plot shows the activation strength for the control subjects. So the box is the 50th percentile, that line in the middle is the average, and then the whiskers extend to the 75th percentile. And then what you see are the two subjects of interest, which are indicated by two little colored bars, a blue bar and a purple bar. The blue bar represents the activation of the sight word reader, and the purple bar shows the activation strength of the decoder. And also, just to let you know, activation for all the subjects was determined comparing the tasks with a control task. So the negative numbers are not deactivation or some kind of weird activation. It's just simply less activation than what was seen in that control task. So these first three graphs I'm showing you show the results for visual orthographic regions. I have the left fusiform, left inferior occipital gyrus, and right inferior occipital gyrus, both critical for visual processing. And for both the left fusiform and the right occipital gyrus, the two subjects with dyslexia are falling within the same range as the controls. But we see that the sight word reader engages the left inferior occipital gyrus much more than everyone else for both words and pseudo words. I'll come back to what this might mean in a few slides after I get through a couple more results. For the semantic region of interest, the left middle temporal gyrus, we see that the decoder, again, falls in the same range as the controls, but the sight word reader, again, engages this region much more for pseudo word reading. Now, this is particularly interesting because it suggests that this child might be processing pseudo words as if they have meaning. Now, remember, these are fake words, they don't have meaning. So perhaps this child is treating pseudo words as real words and trying to find meaning to attach to that visual representation. And then for controlled retrieval, which is the right, both right and left IFG, in this case I've plotted the right IFG, we see that the sight word reader is at the extreme high end of activation as exhibited by controls, but for the most part is really close to what we would see in kids that have no reading disability. So what do these results mean when we consider at least the sight word reader? Well, this child is strongly engaging visual orthographic regions, the semantic region and the right IFG, which is for controlled retrieval. This pattern suggests that the child is most likely treating words as visual objects and is placing a high emphasis on semantics. Even for pseudo words, which do not have meaning. And essentially what we have is this child most likely attempting to map unknown words directly to meaning. Now, if we go back to the dual root, the dual root model of reading, we see that these findings align with the hypothesis that the sight word reader would strongly engage that lexical route, which is what we found. Well, what about the decoder? If we look at the regions associated with phonologic processing, we see that engagement of the left STG is maybe a little bit on the high end for the decoder, but for the left IFG, which we know is involved in segmental phonology, what we see is that the decoder is actually engaging this region very little, if at all. So what does this mean for our decoder? Well, it means that this child is weakly activating phonologic regions, specifically IFG, left IFG, but accuracy, if we had looked back at the standardized test, accuracy on phonologic awareness scores and decoding were low. And so what this seems to suggest is that this child does not have an effective functioning phonological network, but despite that, that child is still relying on reading using a decoding or a phonological decoding approach. And if we look at that dual route model, we can see again that the decoder is attempting to use this non-lexical route, but we know based on that low amount of activation that this route is actually not functioning typically. So essentially this child is relying on an ineffective route for reading. So summarizing study 1, we see preliminary evidence that the different subtypes of dyslexia do appear to be associated with different activation patterns, and that these activation patterns appear to be associated with the strengths or weaknesses of each child. Now for study 2, I investigated organization of the auditory cortex in adults with typical but varied reading. The theoretical framework for this study was the psycholinguistic grain size theory by Ziegler and Goswami. This theory argues that beginning readers face 3 problems regarding the development of decoding skills: availability of enough mapping examples, the consistency of those examples, and then the granularity of the grapheme to phoneme mappings. So what is granularity? Well, you can actually use the analogy of things like grains of wood, grains of food, grains of sand to help. But essentially, if we're talking about phonology and orthography, smaller grain size units would have fewer phonemes or graphemes, and larger grain units would have more phonemes or graphemes, so such as a syllable or a word. So why is granularity even a problem? Well, in inconsistent alphabetic orthographies like English, some mappings do not have a one-to-one correspondence if you're considering granularity. So an example would be shoe, which has 4 graphemes but only 2 phonemes, or the word fix, which has 3 graphemes but 4 phonemes. So in other words, learning to decode accurately requires that a reader can basically manage these mismatched granularities. So what I was interested in was examining phonological representation, specifically in auditory cortex, to see if and how granularity might align with organization. I aimed to determine if the auditory cortex was sensitive to phonological granularity, and if so, if this was related to reading skill. My hypothesis was that since phonological awareness is associated with early reading development, sensitivity to smaller grain units might be seen in those with higher reading skill. The study had 20 typical adults with average to above average reading, and reading was tested outside the scanner in order to get measures of individual variability. So what do we know about the auditory cortex and its role in phonologic processing? Well, the superior temporal gyrus is sensitive to spectral complexity or different sound frequencies. That's what's illustrated in those top 2 figures on the right. It's also sensitive to the temporal structure of sounds or the timing of changes in frequency and amplitude. And then there was a meta-analysis done in 2012 that suggests that the auditory cortex may actually be organized with selectivity or sensitivity based on the number of speech sounds presented. In this study, they found regions that were sensitive to different numbers of phonemes within a stimuli, and this is what's illustrated in that bottom figure. So they broke it up into words, phonemes, and phrases based on the number of phonemes in each. Now, even though this meta-analysis was quite revealing and actually really interesting results, it does have some limitations, and one is just simply the fact that as a meta-analysis, it did not do any direct testing. Second, it included both real and non-words, making it difficult to separate the findings from phonology versus semantic engagement. And then finally, they couldn't really control for other acoustic variables, again, because they were pulling data from other studies. So for my study, I was particularly interested, as I said before, in the auditory cortex. So I limited my analyses to left STG and left MTG. Well, actually, it was bilateral, STG and MTG. I do know that other regions are involved in phonologic processing, like the IFG, but I was particularly interested to see if auditory cortex was organized based on sensitivity to phonological granularity. So I limited my analysis to these regions. As I mentioned, the study involved 20 typical monolingual adults, all of whom were given tests of phonological awareness, reading, and hearing and noise. When the subjects were in the scanner, they were engaged in a task where all the speech stimuli that were presented was either synthetic speech or noise. There were actually 42 pseudo words with 4 phonemes. That was the large granularity condition. 42 pseudo words with only 2 phonemes. That was the small granularity condition. 42 unique noise stimuli as a control. And then as an additional control, we had a pure tone beep, which was used actually as a control task, but not analyzed. And that was simply done to make sure the subjects were awake and listening during scanning. Scanning was done on a 3 Tesla scanner, and I obtained 24 slices per volume with no gap, which yielded a 1.7 millimeter cubed voxels, which is actually pretty fine or small voxels for an fMRI study. So the results show, excitingly, an effect of phonological granularity, specifically with bilateral STG showing greater sensitivity to the small granularity condition, and the left MTG for the large granularity condition. Now in the right, it was a little bit different. The anterior and posterior STG were the regions that showed greater sensitivity to the large granularity condition. Now, I also did a brain behavior analysis. This was done to compare activation of the small granularity area, which was the left STG, to reading skill. And for reading skill, I used performance on a standardized reading test that they did outside the scanner. And specifically what I did was I looked at the total time it took the subjects to decode all the words in the subtest. And that's basically, the more skilled readers had shorter times, so 30 to 40 seconds, and the slightly weaker readers, but remember they're still in the average range, had longer times, so above 40 seconds. And that reading time is what's plotted on that x-axis. Now the y-axis is the difference in activation strength for that region, the left eye STG, when the large granularity condition or activation for the large granularity condition is subtracted from the activation for the small granularity condition. And basically doing this subtraction provides a measure of sensitivity to the smaller grain size. In other words, how much stronger is the STG activating when the stimuli has a smaller phonological grain size. And what you see here plotted in the graph is a negative slope. And what this means is that the adults with more skilled reading or faster reading times had a bigger difference between those conditions or greater sensitivity to the smaller granularity. So what does this mean? The results show that the auditory cortex is sensitive to phonological granularity and that this sensitivity is correlated with reading skill. This may explain how the auditory cortex supports phonological awareness and possibly phonological decoding. And obviously these findings have implications for understanding the brain basis for phonological awareness, and pose questions for why individuals with dyslexia may show concomitant deficits in phonological awareness in reading, and motivates future investigations extending this study to individuals with impaired reading. So in conclusion, the results from the first study reinforce the need to delineate reading skills during diagnostics. This includes testing of words versus pseudo words, the use of compensatory strategies, whether or not a child is relying on meaning, how the child reads familiar words versus less familiar words, if the child is relying on phonological decoding, and if so, how strong is phonological skill, how well can the child map between orthography and phonology, and how strong visual memory is and visual orthographic skills. For that first study, we learned that the sight word reader was treating words as visual objects. This is likely a compensatory strategy and actually a pretty good one. But in this case, it might actually be good for intervention to also include phonological and morphological methods. So that the child has other ways to approach unfamiliar words. Non-phonological methods could be engaged to focus on things like building sight word vocabulary and the ability to determine meaning from context. From a neuropsychological or neurological perspective, this means supporting the compensatory system, which is doing well in this case, but also improving the weaker phonological system. We also learned from that first study that the decoder was relying on a broken phonological system. And in this case, it might be really good for intervention to shift or add non-phonological methods. The goal would be to strengthen visual memory for words and build compensatory strategies. This would include things like working on visual word patterns for both regular and irregular words, maybe using a word wall, integrating a semantic approach, and training the child to use context to assist with word recognition. From a neurological perspective, the phonological system is not functioning effectively, even though the child is trying to use that approach, and therefore a non-phonological approach may engage the intact, but not in a necessarily strongly engaged visual orthographic system, the semantic system, and top-down processing. Organization of the auditory cortex does appear to be sensitive to phonological granularity. That phonological granularity does appear to be correlated with reading skill, and phonological granularity may actually support both phonological awareness and phonological decoding. Now, future research should determine if individuals with dyslexia lack or have a weaker sensitivity to phonological granularity, specifically the smaller grain units, and if so, determine if this then underlies deficits in both phonological awareness and decoding skill. Okay, for a second I thought I froze, so I was just double checking. I was like, oh my God, what if I froze for all of that? I would like to acknowledge my collaborator, James Booth, who's now at Vanderbilt University. For these two studies, data was collected at the Center for Translational Imaging at Northwestern University, and funding was provided by an NIH R1 grant to James Booth and an NICDCS T32 training grant. And I also have pictures on here of our building at CU Boulder. That's our pumpkins that the students decorated a couple years ago for Halloween. And that's our building there. And then I think I have my thank you slide and email. I will take questions now, but this way you also have my contact.
All right, thank you, Dr. Brennan.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions for Dr. Brennan? Don't be bashful.
And I'm gonna, Scott, should I stop my screen share?
Sure.
Okay, if I need it for questions, I can go back.
Yeah. So you can go ahead and use the raise hand function or the thumbs up function. All right. In the meantime, I'll ask you a question. So
Sure.
I was wondering, for experiment 1, the sight reader that you assessed had very, very, very high IQ.
Yes.
So I was wondering, so some of the effects, like they were looking for semantics when they were reading pseudo words, do you think any of those effects could be attributable to very high intelligence?
So, okay, so this is, oh God, there's a lot to unpack in that one question. But so a couple things. One is, it is not unusual for, first of all, the original way dyslexia was identified, if you go years back, was with the discrepancy model, meaning there had to be a big gap between IQ and reading. And so that child actually fits that like classic definition.
Right.
What I'd like to point out, though, is what we've seen over time is that you don't need to have a high IQ to have reading disability. And so when you use just that as a clinical diagnostic tool, you miss kids who actually really do have a reading disability and really do need impairment. So that's the first piece. The other thing is, I've actually done, I didn't present it here today, but I've done a study with college age students with dyslexia. And the two really interesting things that kind of you point out is, now we didn't actually do for them IQ testing. We did other measures of like working memory, vocabulary, so things that were similar or might be part of a verbal IQ, but we didn't actually test IQ. Now, assuming that these were successful college students, most likely their IQs were at least average, if not maybe high or above average.
Right.
But the two interesting things were they all were basically successful at the college or graduate level.
Mm-hmm.
I think because they had developed really good, this was anecdotal, by the way, they had developed really good sight reading and meaning from context skills. To the point where I remember testing one student for the study, and she was so upset that she was doing poorly. And when I scored her, her phonological decoding was below average, but her meaning from context was the GORT, the Great Roller Reading Test. Her meaning, I should say, no, it was comprehension is actually the term in the test. Comprehension was above average. And she even turned to me, because we discussed the results after. She's like, how's that even possible? How can I be understanding this and I don't decode all the words right? And it's because of what you point out. When kids, or adults for that matter, are smart and have a good vocabulary, and have good compensatory strategies that either they developed on their own or a good clinician taught them to use, they will be more successful even when maybe decoding accuracy is slow and ineffective. And so I often, if students come to me who've had, students meaning college or graduate students who have dyslexia and have had many years of intervention, one of the things I tell them at that point is, if they really are using compensatory strategies well, that what they need to do is just keep reading, keep building sight word vocabulary, keep improving their strategies. And even though reading takes longer, they still can digest that same amount of information. The issue becomes when you have kids, or adults for that matter, whose maybe IQ is maybe not that high, but also who haven't developed compensatory strategies to be more effective at reading, despite issues with decoding or like rapid word recognition. So I think I answered you. I went off. That's a big, I teach this in my class, so I'm like, woo. But so I think I answered your question and maybe a little extra.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, Max, it looks like there are some questions in the chat. You want to take
that? So there are two questions. One, someone asked if you could explain phonological granularity again, and I guess the importance of it.
Sure. So phonological granularity is, you can think of it, if you understand phonological awareness, if you think of it first as a skill, I can give you a task like a rhyming task. And so I might say, do these two words rhyme? And you're just listening to them. Well, a rhyme is multiple phonemes. So it's actually a larger unit, right? It's got more speech sounds in there. But if I say, listen to this word and take off either the first sound or the last sound, that's a smaller unit. It's a smaller grain. And what we see developmentally is that kids are most sensitive early on to whole words, and then they're sensitive to rhyme units. And then as they get more advanced and as they start learning to read, actually they kind of reinforce each other, as kids become sensitive to individual speech sounds, which allow them to develop the skills, or maybe it's because they're developing the skills to do letter sounds mapping, that they are sensitive to individual letters. But that's why it's important. If you can't isolate individual letters and you're learning to read in alphabetic orthography, it's going to be really hard, and you're just going to have to memorize whole words. Now, you can read that way, but only the words that you've learned. You can't, you're not going to be able to have a way to interpret words you've never seen before in an alphabetic system. Now I'm jumping ahead, Max. I see the next question.
Yeah, so
Okay, you got it?
Yeah,
yeah,
we'll wrap up with Dr. Hewitt's question. So go ahead and take
okay,
that
sure.
one, and then
So this is a really interesting question. If phonological decoding is weak, would it not make more sense to try and improve their phonological abilities? I would say yes, but there's a caveat to that. And I think, at least my philosophy is, reading is not effective reading, like anyone who's good at reading uses lots of different strategies all the time. So for me, my reading is good. I can decode when I need to. I can recognize words when I need to. If I approach a word in a paper that I'm reading that I've never seen before, I can use meaning from context. I can also go and look it up and write down the definition, or be like, oh, that's what it means. So I have lots of tools in my kit that I can use to be an effective reader. And that's why I'm good at reading. If you have kids who are difficult, their difficulty is in phonological decoding, I would say, yes, you can work on phonological decoding, but that may not be effective. There might be other tools you can add. So I wouldn't say don't do phonological intervention, but I would say do other things too. So you give this kid, or children or adults, a whole set of skills that they can use, that when they are reading, they have the same options that I have when I'm reading. So, and the other thing is, things like morphological approaches actually are somewhere between meaning and sound, where you're actually teaching them letter patterns. You're teaching them the things like morphemes that have meaning in words. And actually that tends to actually be a really good strategy, which is not technically a phonological approach, but does tap into that phonology. And so I wouldn't say no, but I would say you want to basically build the whole toolkit. That would be my argument.
all right, great. Okay,
Thank you.
so let's move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Lakeisha Johnson. Dr. Johnson is an assistant professor at Florida State University in the School of Communication Sciences and Disorders. She's also a faculty member in the Florida Center for Reading Research, and she was previously a research scientist at Georgia State University in the Urban Child Study Center. She earned her BA from South Carolina State University and both her MA and PhD from Florida State University. And she's published her research in many high-profile journals, including Educational Psychology Review, Reading and Writing, and Topics in Language Disorders. So without further delay, we'll have Dr. Johnson give her talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you to you all for joining us today for the discussion. Dr. Brennan, I'm really excited to hear some of your responses to the last part of some of those questions, because I have some slides about some of this language-based literacy instruction. So I think it's going to tie together really nicely. So today I'm going to be discussing how we distinguish between disorder, disadvantage, and difference, more specifically in African-American students. So as I go through, I'm going to start off with a little video to kind of center us and put us all on the same page of why the linguistic experiences of African-American students are so important when we work with them as SLPs and educators. So I'll talk a little bit about African American English as a dialect system, the relations between dialect and literacy outcomes, and then some assessment practices and intervention strategies that are culturally and linguistically sensitive. So in the chat, I would love for you, if you won't mind indulging me, let me know some of the things that you that give you pause in terms of distinguishing between disorder, disability, and disadvantage, and different. So if you could put those in the chat. I'm going to also play this really short TED Talk from Dr. Jamila Lyascott. Some of you may have seen it before. It is amazing, and it's really going to center our discussion today.
Today, a baffled lady observed the shell where my soul dwells and announced that I'm articulate. Which means that when it comes to enunciation and diction, I don't even think of it because I'm articulate. So when my professor asks a question and my answer is tainted with the connotation of urbanized suggestion, there's no misdirected intention. Pay attention, because I'm articulate. So when my father asks, what kind of thing is this? My articulate answer never goes amiss. I say, Father, this is the impending problem at hand, and when I'm on the block, I switch it up just because I can. So when my boy says, what's good with you, son? I say, I just fall out with them people, but I done. And sometimes in class, I might pause the intellectual sound and flow to ask, yo, why these books never be about my peoples? Yes, I have decided to treat all three of my languages as equal because I'm articulate. But who controls articulation? Because the English language is a multifaceted oration subject to indefinite transformation. Now you may think that it is ignorant to speak broken English, but I'm here to tell you that even articulate Americans sound foolish to the British. So when my professor comes on the block and says hello, I stop him and say, no, you're being inarticulate. The proper way is to say what's good. Now, you may think that's too hood, that's not cool, but I'm here to tell you that even our language has rules. So when mommy mocks me and says, y'all be mad going to the store, I say, mommy, no, that sentence is not following the law. Never does the word mad go before a present participle. That's simply the principle of this English. If I had the vocal capacity, I would sing this from every mountaintop, every suburbia, and every hood. Because the only God of language is the one recorded in the genesis of this world, saying it is good. So I may not always come before you with excellency of speech, but do not judge me by my language and assume that I'm too ignorant to teach, because I speak 3 tongues. One for each: home, school, and friends. I'm a trilingual orator. Sometimes I'm consistent with my language now and switch it up so I don't bore later. Sometimes I fight back 2 tongues while I use the other one in the classroom, and when I mistakenly mix them up, I feel crazy like I'm cooking in the bathroom. I know that I had to borrow your language because mine was stolen. But you can't expect me to speak your history wholly while mine is broken. These words are spoken by someone who is simply fed up with the Eurocentric ideals of this season. And the reason I speak a composite version of your language is because mine was raped away along with my history. I speak broken English so the profuse and gashes can remind us that our current state is not a mystery. I'm so tired of the negative images that are driving my people mad. So unless you've seen it rob a bank, stop calling my hair bad. I'm so sick of this nonsensical racial disparity, so don't call it good unless your hair is known for donating to charity as much as has been raped away from our people. How can you expect me to treat their imprint on your language as anything less than equal? Let there be no confusion. Let there be no hesitation. This is not a promotion of ignorance. This is a linguistic celebration. That's why I put trilingual on my last job application. I can help to diversify your consumer market is all I wanted them to know. And when they call me for the interview, I'll be more than happy to show that I can say what's good, what's agwan, and of course, hello.
Okay, I love this because she talks specifically about it being a linguistic celebration, which is really, really what I want to impart on all of you, especially those of you who are working with school-age students who happen to also be dialect speakers. And so when we think about non-mainstream dialects, they differ systematically from mainstream American English, which of course is the language that we know is used in media and informal situations. And these non-mainstream dialects can vary based on lots of variables, such as race, SES, and region. So all of these are socio-demographic variables. AAE in particular is where I do a lot of my research. And so African American English is differentiated in all of these language domains, but namely in phonology and morphology. And so it's really important, as Dr. Lyascott mentioned in her poem, there are systematic rules. This is a linguistic form, and there are rules that it follows. So when we talk about dialects, we have to talk about them in that way. And so AAE overlaps with other mainstream dialects such as Southern White English, Gullah Geechee, and Hispanic influenced English. It has been long regarded as a low prestige dialect, and so it's heavily stigmatized both in academics and in mainstream social contexts. Now, a lot of sociolinguists posit that a lot of this stigmatization that happens with AAE is more so based on the adverse stereotypes and misconceptions of African Americans themselves and less on the actual language system, because remember, we're talking about this as a language system. And so AAE has been studied extensively over time in the context of language disorders and literacy achievement. There's been a lot of work, even just in our field of speech-language pathology, in terms of how dialect use impacts literacy achievement. And a lot of this work has been largely focused on children from low-income backgrounds. So AAE varies. Its use varies along a continuum from low to high, and that could depend on lots of different things. The rate at which a person speaks dialect, the amount of it or frequency, is dialect density. And so this term dialect density goes along with linguistic distance. And so this distance is how far a person's dialect or language is from another. So remember, as we said, mainstream American English is a dialect in and of itself. So we all speak dialects, right? We have to come to the table knowing that we all speak these different dialects. And MAE in and of itself, what we use to measure our students' performance when we're looking at them in terms of assessments, it is a dialect of itself, but in the US right now, it is the standard or the point of reference. And so this is really important because SLPs attempt to measure that magnitude of linguistic distance, right? We're looking to see how far our students are from mainstream American English developmental milestones and things that we know are typical. And so SES has been a consistent predictor of dialect density. And so if you recall the title, we're talking about disorder, disadvantage, and difference. And so you know that there's going to be a lot of overlap between those things. Very often, I'm sure all of you have probably heard the phrase disorder, difference versus disorder. Asha has talked about it a lot. There are position statements, and we all talk about difference versus disorder. But I'd like to also add that we have to consider disadvantage, right? So it's problematic when we talk about SES being a consistent predictor of dialect density, because we know that language weaknesses that are associated with disadvantage, i.e. poverty, any of those things can present very similarly to the linguistic features of AAE. And so when it comes to literacy skills for African American students, hopefully a lot of you are familiar with the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. The NAEP performance from 2019, only 18% of African American fourth graders were reading at or above grade level expectation in comparison to 45% of white students. Over time, this has been known as the Black-White Achievement Gap. And we know that this gap has not changed much at all over the last few years. The gap is ever present, and it is the same. What we also saw this year, which was really interesting, was there was actually a decline in NAEP performance from 2017 to 2019. Even more blaringly problematic for me is that the biggest decline was seen in the lowest performers, who were students of color and students who were poor, so students from low SES backgrounds. And so 79%, this is staggering, 79% of students who are eligible for the National School Lunch Program, so free and reduced lunch, did not meet reading proficiency. That is a problem, right? We should all be in agreement that that is a problem. And so while there have been massive, huge advances in terms of the science of reading, we all know the phrase, we know exactly how important it is to teach kids in a systematic and explicit way how to read. Despite all of these approaches, many African American students still struggle. And what I'd like to point out is that a lot of reasons for these struggles may be due to conditions that happen both inside and outside of the school. So there are systemic things that happen, systemic racism that is embedded into our educational system as well as our political system that contribute to additional risks for reading achievement. So things like insufficient and inadequate school resources, poor instructional quality, school segregation and resegregation, concentrated neighborhood poverty. It can go on and on and on. All of these things, these cumulative things, still may impact how African American children are performing. And so when you look at both dialect use, particularly AAE, and how it impacts literacy skills, there has been a numerous amount of studies that have been done. And one that I'll highlight is a meta-analysis from Gatlin and Wanzik in 2015 that showed that there's a moderate and inverse relationship between frequency of oral dialect usage, so oral or what you express in terms of spoken dialect usage, and reading and writing outcomes. Keep in mind that when we talk about dialects, very often most of them, these dialects of English are oral dialects. We sometimes also see some of their linguistic features in writing, but for the most part, they're oral dialects. Associations may be even larger for students who have language and reading impairment. So they took this work and extended it even farther in 2017. So there are tons of different literacy skills that can be impacted, decoding, phonological awareness, spelling, reading comprehension, and writing as well. And so in and of itself, it is important for everyone to know that using dialect does not cause literacy deficits. So in and of itself, dialect does not cause literacy deficits. It's worth repeating again, right? Dialect is not what's causing the literacy deficits. We know that many of the students who struggle with reading often have foundational oral language skills, right? When we look at a lot of the reading research and when we throw things, different predictors into our models, we will see that over and beyond what dialect predicts, oral language often is going to predict more variance, which you'll see from some of those studies from Gatlin and Wanzik that they looked at. And so, despite the compounding vulnerabilities that many African American students face in relation to reading, they can still meet grade level expectations. If we follow the recommendations from the National Reading Panel, if we look at everything we know about the science of reading, and there's just been a 26 article special issue topic on the science of reading that just came out, last week, I think, specifically on the science of reading and how we should be teaching. We know that if we provide systematic and explicit instruction, all children, regardless of race, ethnicity, even disability status, can be taught to read, right? So one of the things that I'd like to implore SLPs to focus on is that it may be more beneficial, especially for students that we're working with that also have reading issues or reading impairments, is to focus on oral language skills. And so we can do this through utilizing language-based, dialect-informed instruction. And while we know that, of course, oral language is really important for all students, I'm going to pull out to you some of the ways why it may be really important for African American students. And so this is actually a graphic from an upcoming book chapter that I have with Ryan James, where we're talking about the impact of non-mainstream dialect use and language assessment. And so you'll see this overlapping Venn diagram, right? We very often, as I said, talk about disorder and difference. But I'm also going to add in one of the things he wanted to make people more aware of is that socioeconomic disadvantage really plays a role. So when we think about language and language disorder and dialect differences, we know that we're going to see grammatical things, grammatical features in terms of morphosyntax that will be very similar in terms of dialect differences, as well as students who may present with a language disorder. We also know that things like vocabulary, if we have a child with limited vocabulary, that could be an indicator of impairment, right? But it can also be an indicator of disadvantage. We know poverty in terms of lack of access and resources, all of those things can then become an impact. The relationship between SES and dialect density, you'll see on the right side of this. And then, of course, in the middle, you have the interactions across each. What I'd like to say is quite often when we teach this, and I've even been guilty of it in previous years, we teach dialect versus disorder as a dichotomy, like it's a binary thing. You either have the disorder or you're a dialect user, right? And we know that that's not the case. I'm glad you're finding this visual very useful because we worked really hard to try to ensure we were kind of capturing all of the things that could be at play. We know there are students who speak dialect who are also who also have DLD or developmental language disorder, right? And so it's almost an unintended kind of consequence that it leads clinicians to kind of say it has to be one or the other, as opposed to teasing apart the fact that disorder can exist within the context of linguistic differences as well as economic disadvantage. And so very often, SLPs in our field, we have to use standardized assessments, right? Our gold standard for diagnostics is norm reference assessments. But we also know that they lack sufficient sensitivity and specificity with CLD populations, so children from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, as well as children from low SES backgrounds, right? So this puts SLPs in a very tough place in terms of whether or not they're overdiagnosing or they are underdiagnosing, where children aren't receiving the services that they actually need. So what I wanted to do today is to provide you with some alternative, both assessment and intervention techniques that you could go out and start to immediately apply, or also start to talk with, for those of you who are also professors and doing this work, start to talk with your students about who are going to be our next generation of SLPs. And so we know that there are a lot of early reports. If you look at the literature, there's been a lot in terms of the specific assessments that are biased towards students of color, students from CLD backgrounds. If you look at tests like the PPVT, we can see why they're on their 4th and 5th edition, because there have been these studies that have gone and said that these are some of the things that are biases towards certain populations. And it can be both cultural and linguistic biases. And so it's crucial that children who do have language impairment or DLD are accurately identified early enough and also provided with evidence-based instruction, because we know that what happens, we know language is the foundation to literacy. And so if they don't have those strong oral language foundational skills, it can impact emergent literacy and later literacy skills. But it's also important that for children who are impacted by disadvantage, so children growing up in poverty, to have the opportunities to be provided with rich instruction that allows them to strengthen those language skills. So a few of the things that I'll mention in terms of alternative methods are described in a recent article that I published with Dr. Gatlin in IDA's International Dyslexia Association's Perspectives on Language and Literacy journal. And so some of the things that we pulled out were contrastive and non-contrastive analysis, which I'm gonna really break down in a few slides. Language sample analysis, I mean, you can raise your hand, give me a little reaction if you know about language samples, but then in actual practice, you know, language samples take a lot of time, right? It takes a lot of time and effort. And so, yeah, we don't often want to use them, but that process of really thoroughly describing language production is so helpful, especially with CLD populations, because we can gather it in numerous ways, whether that's a story retell, a narrative, a conversation, a play-based sample. We can do all of those things to get information about the child's language in every language skills in every domain. We can also look at macro and microstructure kinds of stuff if we want to look at narratives. One of the other things in terms of alternative assessment techniques is this process of dynamic assessment. We don't use dynamic assessment as often as SLPs as other educators do. Educators very often talk about dynamic assessment, but very often we don't use it as much. And so dynamic assessment, of course, is this process of combining both assessment and treatment approaches. And so it allows you to, it's the test, teach, retest model. So you test a child, get baseline information on what they can do, and then you try to scaffold, teach the skill to see whether or not they are actually able to accomplish it. So what we know about AAE speakers and dialect speakers is that students who speak dialects will show more modifiability during the test, teach, retest model than those who have true language deficits. It won't be enough in that little bit of time that you provide and scaffold for a child with a true language impairment. And then, of course, processing dependent tasks. I know Dr. Brennan, I know you're very interested, I think, as well in like executive functioning. And so looking at some of these processing-based tasks, working memory, non-word repetition, all of those things are going to be really helpful because it removes some of that information in terms of background knowledge and prior experiences. We know that kids who are socioeconomically disadvantaged may not come in with a lot of this background knowledge and vocabulary, as well as Dr. Brennan was saying when she was answering some of those questions about the importance of continuing to read because of what it gives you in terms of vocabulary exposure. And yes, I will be talking in the very next slide about contrastive and non-contrastive because it's the one that most people don't know as much about. And so contrastive analysis is this concept of systematically studying two languages or two dialects to see and identify their structural differences and similarities. So how, you remember I talked about linguistic distance. So you want to take in contrastive analysis, let's say you gather or elicit a language sample from a student, and now you want to see how linguistically distant they are from mainstream American English. So contrastive analysis is that process of looking at the different features that they're using in terms of linguistic features to see how far it is. So dialect density is that degree to which dialect really impacts the overall spoken production. So it's how frequently you're using dialect. Some of the cut points that we currently utilize, a low dialect user uses it in fewer than 10% of utterances, where a high density user is going to use it in more than 50% of their productions. So think about it like type token ratio, which is something that we're typically familiar with as SLPs. It's a ratio of dialect features used to the total number of words that they use. So low users are only using dialect features in about 10% of their utterances, whereas high frequency dialect users are using it at about 50% of productions. And so there are these two ways that we can look at features when it comes to contrastive analysis. And so there's contrastive and non-contrastive. And so we like to think about this as dialect sensitive features. And so dialect sensitive features are the ones that can be produced differently in AAE and MAE. So if at any point you've seen any of some of the kind of seminal work in terms of communication sciences and disorders in dialects from Julie Washington, Holly Craig, Carol Connor, Nicole Patton-Terry, any of those people, you'll see that they talk a lot about contrastive features. So zero plural, the things that we kind of always hear, zero past tense, copula, or variable use of. Any of those things are contrasting it because we're talking about that a child who's a dialect speaker is doing something that is different than what actually happens in NAE. Dialect neutral, on the other hand, are features that are produced the same in AAE and MAE. So we consider those to be non-contrastive. And so for SLPs, I came up with this chart based on two articles from Seymour and colleagues and Terry and Connor. And it's really important if we're gonna do, and if we really want to find out and tease apart whether it's disorder or whether it's difference, it's really important that we can't verbs may agree, other times they may not. Whereas we see, or sometimes I'm going to use plurals, other times I'm not, depending on the context. What we do also know is that children who have true language disorders, more or less, are going to not use these features across the board. So these features are going to be missing. These are going to be the ones you have to actually teach. Non-contrastive features, or these dialect neutral features, are the ones that I think are the most important for SLPs to start to use in your assessment practices. So let's say you have a language sample, or let's say you even don't have the time for the language sample, but you've given a test like the SELF or a test like the TOLD, right? And you do that one where they have to, is it like either like word formulations, where sentence formulations, where you give them a target word and they have to create a sentence based on the picture. You can look at some of those features that the child uses and determine and look at these dialect neutral features, because a dialect speaker is going to always still use articles, right? Articles are a thing. That is not like how she said in terms of there are rules that are followed. In AAE, it is a rule that I should still use articles, right? But we know that children with language impairments may not use those articles. Things like modals, conjunctions, demonstratives, prepositions, those are things that AAE speakers are going to do. They're going to have those linguistic features. And so if we really want to start to work more closely to teasing apart difference versus disorder, then these are some of the places where I think we have to be sure that we not only look at some of the more frequently known dialect features, we also look at the ones that are dialect neutral, that across the board still follow the linguistic rules of AAE. So then you may think, okay, what's next? After I finally determine that the child does have a language disorder, what do I do? Well, we know that there are links between poverty, oral language ability, spoken linguistic variation, or dialect. So there are links between all three of those. So in my opinion, it's really important that we explore how we can not only use, but also increase the linguistic power of AAE speakers. So a lot of you may be familiar with the term bidialectalism. What this is it is that ability to be able to have the linguistic flexibility, that meta-linguistic awareness to be able to code switch. And when I say code switch, I am more so in my work, I always tell my students, the clients that I work with, my families, it is never my goal to change the way you speak orally. That is not my goal. I want our dialects, our oral dialects, to be appreciated, to be valued, for you to continue to keep that, because it's a part of your culture, and it's just as important as if we were to get super awe-inspired by a person who speaks 3 languages, right? There are benefits, which we also know if you read any of the bilingual literature, there are benefits to being both bidialectal and bilingual. And so I like to think of it as linguistic power, students who are able to go back and forth and utilize them. And when I'm talking with my students, it's more about the written language that they're able to have and show this linguistic power. Because unfortunately, right now, that's the way that they are graded in schools, right? Academic performance is graded on whether you are writing in academic English. And so we have to be able to help them leverage the linguistic skills that they have, that meta-linguistic awareness that's so important, to be able to help improve these reading outcomes. And so 60% of the variance, as I was saying, in reading comprehension is explained by language skills by 3rd grade in some recent studies by Lark. And so we know, in a study that I did, we know that we can use these linguistic differences as a launching pad. We should be using what our kids bring to school to leverage their experiences when it comes to reading. And so from this article, I pulled out a few tables. This goes so perfectly with what Dr. Brennan was saying, because we have these language components on one side, but you also see how it's directly connected to a reading skill, right? So we can target these reading skills through these language components to give us language-infused instruction for reading. So if we're talking about phonology, then you're going to teach sound awareness, right? You're going to teach alliteration and onset and rhymes, all of those things. If we're talking about semantics, the reading skill there, of course, is vocabulary, right? So it also just goes to show how we as SLPs have although a lot of us don't think of reading sometimes as being something that we're really good at teaching, we are intrinsically prepared to do this because we know language, right? And so if we have semantics, you're going to utilize those things like word webs and semantic maps in order to help kids in terms of improving some of these reading-based skills in morphology and syntax, decoding and word analysis. All of those things are really helpful. And then finally, in order to help students increase that metalinguistic awareness or increase their abilities to be bidialectal, to increase that linguistic power that they have, there are a few strategies that SLPs can use within their interventions. So contrastive analysis, being able to make comparisons. I always talk with students, there is no right way, no wrong way. There is, maybe this is the way you read it in a book at school. The way that you say it is not wrong. We're never gonna say that you using your dialect, your first language, none of that is ever wrong. This is just the way that it's done at school. So you make sure you have contrastive analysis can be used for that. Sentence sorts are an example, helping students increase their metalinguistic awareness by identifying some of these, grammatical features in sentences. So they have to be explicitly taught some of these. Transforming them, where you can change sentences from AAE to MAE and vice versa. I used to like to do it with song lyrics. So we would take song lyrics and, you know, if you take the rap song that's appropriate and change it into, how would we make this sound like it was in a book at school, right? And then formulation, of course. So you see how it goes from exactly how we would do in language therapy, from receptive to expressive, right? So in closing, some of the clinical implications for SLPs. Big reminder, bidialectalism and of course bilingualism, they are not risks that are in need of being remedied. If you leave with nothing else, I hope that that's what you leave with. They're not in need of being remedied. We need to consider that dialect speakers have unique language experiences that may have different implications for how they learn MAE or how they learn how to read. And so when we utilize culturally and linguistically sensitive approaches, things such as SLPs and educators increasing their awareness of dialect forms, ensuring that scoring modifications are used when available for standardized tests, including statements on your IEP reports that say this student demonstrated some dialect sensitive features or blah, 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 blah in your reports that makes it known. Using alternative assessment techniques, as I mentioned, and considering that the importance of background knowledge. So when you do that vocabulary, that reading comprehension, even utilizing things that are strong suits for children of color. So we know that oral storytelling is a strong suit. So use that as opposed to some of these point and respond types of tests where we may not get the information that we need. And then finally, I'm extremely passionate about the use of diverse books and materials within our therapy sessions and within our classrooms to ensure that the materials we use look like the children who sit in the seats in front of us. So it's really important to not just use them where they may have a kid of color in the book or in the flashcards that you're using, but how is it authentically relating to the stories that these children deal with in their regular lives? So the references are there for you. And then of course, my contact information. Like I said, I am extremely passionate about diverse children's books. I do run a website and social media that focuses specifically on how to promote language and literacy skills using diverse children's books. So with that, I'll take any questions that you may have.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. Let's open it up to questions. Don't be bashful. Go ahead, you can post them in the chat, or you can use the raise hand feature or the thumbs up feature. In the meantime, I'll go ahead and ask a question.
Sure.
So Dr. Johnson, you were mentioning that you can liken bidialectalism to bilingualism in that there's some advantages to that flexibility.
Right.
So, yeah, so there are some of us here are interested in whether bilinguals have certain cognitive advantages in executive functioning. Do you think those advantages, like better executive functioning, extend to individuals who are bidialectal?
Absolutely, and that's actually some of the work that I'm working on currently. And so what was, gosh, I was about to say, what year is this? Last year's ASHA, 2019, I actually presented on the cognitive advantage, whether we saw that repeated in students who were bidialectal and African American, and we ddid. And so
Okay.
children who were dialect speakers, the stronger the dialect speakers, and these were the ones who also performed better on the Wisconsin card sorting tasks.
Okay, cool. Awesome. All right.
Thanks
And,
to all in the chat. I see some people saying thanks and they have to leave for 2 o'clock. Thank you all for joining.
okay, are there any questions in the chat here?
Yes, Jan Edwards is currently investigating, I think, bidialectal advantages. So she's looking at whether or not helping to increase bidialectalism through Toggle Talk, whether that strengthens some of those skills, and also whether that I think also helps with language performance and reading outcomes.
There is a question asking about the techniques and strategies that you've used personally as an SLP that you've felt helped your students. This is also something that I'm wondering too, because
literally, literally the things that were on that page, those are all things that I have done. So those I'll share it again, like those translating tasks, literally, we took songs. Like this was back when I did a lot of my school-based experiences in elementary and middle schools. And so we would take, I was in Tallahassee at that point. So T-Pain was a big rapper at that point. He's from Tallahassee. So we would take lyrics to songs and transform them. We would take them and change them. We would do identification things where we would take books that were written, books by authors of color that included dialect features, so books that have AAE within them. In the same article that's on the screen, Johnson and Gatlin, I have a table with some books that feature AAE within the text. And so we would take those books, we would read them and talk about specifically those grammatical features. Because for a lot of students, what I found in my practice is that for some of us, it's just by happenstance. Nobody told me I needed to code switch. My grandmother, my mom never said I should change the way I talk in certain situations. It just kind of happened. But for other students, they have to be made more explicitly aware. And unfortunately, even when I say that, unfortunately, the way that our system, our educational system is set up, you know, it should be fine for you to talk however you want to talk, and you know, your culture and your linguistic differences be appreciated, but we also know that that is not the case. So that's why I like to talk about it in the sense of linguistic power, right? You are building more linguistic power because you're going to be able to do both this, both that, X, Y, Z. So those are some of the strategies that I have used.
And I think Dr. is it Jerometta or Garametta has a question? Okay,
Sure.
go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Hi, Dr. Johnson. Thank you so much. This was incredibly informative. I have a question for you working with older bidialectal students and their writing skills. And I'm wondering, these strategies are amazing that you've mentioned, but I'm wondering, you know, if the stakes are a little higher and the expectations are a little higher, if you might have some strategies working at that point.
Well, yeah, I think a large part of that, so there's an intervention, well, I don't want to call, it's not an intervention, it's a program called DAWS, Increasing Dialect Awareness. It's for third through fifth grade, second to fourth graders. A study that I have, I think it may be on the references from 2017, but what we did was we literally took the most frequently occurring dialect features in African American English, the ones that were variable, so plural S, past tense, and we looked at them in children's writings. And so it was an 8-week program where we specifically taught these features, but we taught them in this way where it was contrastive analysis. And then we started with receptive skills, things like being able to do card sorts or sentence sorts, switching them out to where, like, let's say this is a sentence that has subject-verb agreement that is typical for MAE versus one that would look like an AAE. Doing that, and then at the end of that week, it was like a 4-day program. So 2 days receptive, 2 days expressive. And then on that last day, they would have to write. And so we would have a prompt that specifically would kind of target that dialect feature. So let's say I'm targeting past tense ED. I'm going to have a prompt like, tell me about a time when, because that's going to automatically prompt you to have to use past tense ED. And what we saw is that students who participated within that program, where they were explicitly taught that there were differences and explicitly kind of given this instructions in terms of, we're going to do it this way for do it like you would at home versus do it like if you were reading a book at school. That having those strategies and hearing it that way was able to help them improve in their writing skills. Because like I said, I don't want a child to change anything about their oral speech. So if you're a dialect speaker, it is perfectly fine with me. Even some of my students are here right now. I use dialect in my classes because if we don't normalize it as professors with all of these letters behind our name, why are we gonna think that it's appropriate when our students do it, right? Like we say that as a profession, we value CLD, but that's not what we show when we tell our clinicians who are in our program that, you know, they have to take an assessment that says whether or not they are dialect speakers themselves, or, you know, those are the kinds of things. So that's usually what I do, and it's very much so about writing for me. It's not at all about oral speech.
Great, that's really helpful. Thank you so much.
No problem. I did get one message, a private message. What's a go-to answer when someone says, why don't you just fit in? Get so mad, but you know, unfortunately, the onus is on dialect speakers to be the one to code switch. Now, remember what I said, we all use dialects, right? We all use them. And so the onus though is on us, and I don't like that. So I don't like telling a person that they need to or that they have to. That's not my role. I don't tell you whether you need to or have to, and especially for us as SLPs, that's not within our scope anyway. What we treat is the children who are dialect speakers who also have language impairments, which is why it's important to figure out who actually has impairment. So I do say that, you know, in terms of how do you just fit in, that's a really hard question, because I don't have a response to that other than this is the way that I talk, right? This is it, and I can switch. I can be like this, or I can also I like to give the example for the person who asked that, Sarah. I like to give the example. I'm from South Carolina. If I go home and I'm there for more than a few days, my husband is like, "Who are you? Like, you don't sound it." There's no different to me. That's no different at all. So that's some of what I like to do and respond. And Miriam, sure, come take my class. Come to FSU.
We have some fans in the chat, it looks like. All right, we're coming up on 2 p.m. Melissa, do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, so I was going to come up with some question that bridged both talks together, and then Dr. Johnson kind of was doing that bridging throughout. So I feel like we sort of accomplished our goal of talking about reading in the brain and society. And I would love to see neuroimaging studies looking at these questions of dialect, the continuum of dialect disorder. My personal interest is in mapping orthography. So I would love to know more just about how these dialect sensitive and dialect neutral phonological features map onto the orthographic system. And I think that those are some of the more brain-based questions that we can be asking, because we've studied a lot of that in monolingual English speakers, and we've also studied a lot of that in, you know, Mandarin speakers, but actually studying it in a more of a diglossic context, I think would be really interesting.
Yes, that would be extremely interesting to do. And that's something that's, you know, kind of up next for me, looking at some of these executive functioning features, continuing to look at them, because we know there's so many ways to look at executive functioning skills. I'm really interested in what makes some people automatically code switch. That was a lot of what my dissertation was about, and how I really got interested into it. So what are those underlying systems? And so a lot of it is executive functioning skills. But we also know that a part of that is the students. There's one really interesting study that talks about students who are super high dialect speakers. they also perform really well. It's a U-shaped curve. I think it's Connor and Terry. I can't remember what year, maybe 2010, but it's Terry, Thomas Tate, Love, and Connor. And so they talk about this U-shaped curve when it comes to dialects and how they're low dialect users, or the students who don't use a lot of dialect at all, so low to none, and then high dialect users. And what we see is that high dialect users are good language users because their dialect use is more complex. And so structurally, it's more complex in terms of the linguistic system. And so the really, really high dialect users and the ones who use low to none both had much better reading outcomes. So there's nothing wrong at all. When you have good language, you just have good language, whether you're using dialect or not. So looking at some of those other underlying skills, Dr. Randazzo, did I pronounce it right? Yes, I think would be extremely interesting.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, well, on that note, we'll end it.
Yes, successful first event. Thank you. Thanks for our two speakers and everyone for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you
so much for having us.